There is one universal constant in any military, and that is interservice rivalries. Army versus Navy versus Air Force. And if the country has it, Marines or Coast Guard thrown in for good measure. This can take the shape of good-natured ribbing, like Marines in crayons or the chair force joke. It can also take the shape of literally shooting at each other, and assassinating officers of the other branch. Looking at you here, Imperial Japan. It's a miracle their army and navy could cooperate at all. All of that being said, though, that's on a higher level. To go with a tighter focus, you also have rivalries between ship crews. This also has a range of friendly to not so friendly arguments. A classic example is rival sports teams. These could come together to play games and compete with each other, while sniping at each other verbally the rest of the time. Like any sports rivalry, really. The topic of this video, however, will be 3 examples of less friendly rivalries. 2 American examples and 1 Japanese. I'm sure that the Royal Navy or the German Navy or any other fleet has similar things, but these are the ones I'm familiar with. If you have something for another navy, by all means put it in the comments below, like Rodney being bawed at everywhere she went. Now, that aside, let's look at the first story for this video. This is one I covered previously in one of my old history short stories videos. The rivalry between Enterprise and Saratoga during the Pacific War. This story comes from the excellent Carrier Warfare in the Pacific. If you can find it, and like first-hand accounts, this is a great resource. In this case, we have a story by one Roger Bond. He joined Saratoga in early 1943 at the height of the Pacific War. More importantly, perhaps, at the time when the United States was running out of fleet carriers. For a time, it was just Saratoga or Enterprise swapping places as the only functional fleet carrier, at least in the Pacific, while Ranger was doing her own thing in the Atlantic. Understandably, this bred some resentment on both ships. According to Bond, if the 2 ships were sharing a berth, the crews would constantly get into fights. Directly quoting him, it was as bad as that between Americans and Japanese. I doubt that, but it does speak to how bad it could get. He says there was a lot of jealousy, name-calling, and general resentment between the 2 crews, to the point that all it took was some alcohol and one wrong word before fights broke out. Bond even says that the Navy tried to keep the 2 crews apart because it was that bad. This all seems quite terrible, especially during wartime. It is, however, probably understandable. Bond goes further to explain things. He says that there was a feeling on Saratoga in the spring of 1943 that they were the only carrier, that the crew wondered where Enterprise was. Remember what I said earlier? That Saratoga and Enterprise swapped roles as the one fleet carrier in this period? That created a situation where the crews could get bitter. I wouldn't be surprised if the same happened on Enterprise in reverse, with a touch of Pork Queen being thrown at Saratoga for her torpedo damage, which I think is unearned, but then again, Saratoga is my favorite ship. In any case, the crew on Saratoga might have been bitter at Enterprise getting all the fame and publicity, while they fought hard in their own right. Either way, this was a rough rivalry, if Bond is to be believed. It wasn't even the worst for American ships, as we'll see. Before that, though, Saratoga and HMS Victorious, when they served together, seemed to have no issues. The crews got along just fine, with Sarah's crew even nicknaming the other ship Vicky. Bond relates a story of sending dehydrated potatoes over to Victorious when she ran low on provisions, and then sending a cook over when the British had no idea how to cook the things to actually taste good. Quite a difference in relationship, isn't it? That does wrap up Saratoga, though, so let's move to the second American example. This one is the more famous of the 2, by far. USS South Dakota, and USS Washington. I won't spend as much time on this one, specifically because it's better known. However, for the context, on the night of November 14th, 1942, the American and Japanese fleets clashed off Guadalcanal. This battle saw a Japanese force led by the battleship Kirishima engage an American group with two battleships, Washington and South Dakota. As was common with these night battles off Guadalcanal, the Japanese had an early edge. They wiped out the escorting American destroyer force before shifting to South Dakota. This unfortunate ship had suffered multiple electrical failures during this battle. First technical glitches, and then the shock of firing her guns compounding those glitches. By the time this was worked out, South Dakota was entirely too close to the Japanese. They proceeded to focus fire on her, with the cruisers and destroyers, in particular, ravaging her superstructure, which knocked her radar and fire control out once again. Through all of this, USS Washington, under the able command of Admiral Willis Lee, closed in undetected. The fires on South Dakota kept her as the focus of Japanese attention, allowing Washington to get the jump on Kirishima. She proceeded to blast the Japanese ship into next week, leading to Kirishima capsizing and sinking a couple hours later. Now, if it were just this, you probably think there isn't much room for a rivalry. South Dakota's crew would have been thankful for being rescued, and while Washington's crew might have been a bit smug, it would be well earned. However, things did not end that way. South Dakota, with far more damage, was sent home for repairs. She arrived in New York for proper repair work on December 18, 1942. At some point in this process, South Dakota, Battleship X for security reasons, was credited with sinking Kirishima. The most common variation of this story is South Dakota's crew making the claim. They told the press it was their ship that sank Kirishima, in spite of knowing very well that they definitely had not. As you could expect, Battleship X being credited with the victory did not lead to warm and fuzzy feelings on USS Washington. In fact, her crew was, justifiably, livid. This began one of the most infamous rivalries in United States Navy history. Washington and South Dakota's crews were constantly fighting each other, with words, fists, and any convenient tool laying around nearby. Washington's crew was incredibly angry at having their victory stolen out from under them after they saved South Dakota's bacon. One assumes that South Dakota's crew, meanwhile, were angry at the actions of some of them coming down on all of them. Regardless, it apparently got so bad that the Navy tried to keep the crews from going on liberty at the same time, to prevent unfortunate incidents on shore leave. It was just bad all around. One can't really blame Washington's crew in this situation. In any event, that finishes up the second example. The third and final example for today comes from the Japanese side. There's less concrete material on this one, as is often the case with wartime Japanese records. However, there's a persistent story that has cropped up in recent years. As the story goes, there was an intense rivalry between the oldest and newest Japanese carriers going into the Second World War. Shokaku and Zuikaku, the new kids on the block, were looked down upon by Akagi and Kaga. The crews on the old conversions, veterans to a man, looked on the newbies with smug arrogance and disdain. This being Imperial Japan, it's something I can certainly see happening. It's an interesting example, in any case, for two reasons. First, the mirror to the first example in Enterprise and Saratoga. The crews of the old conversions having a rivalry with the new purpose-built carriers. For the record, I haven't heard of a similar thing with Soryu and Hiryu. It almost certainly happened, but I haven't heard of it. That aside, the second interesting thing is in how this rivalry ended up. Akagi and Kaga rampaged across the Pacific in the early war, in addition to their service in bombing China. but they were both lost at Midway fairly early in the conflict. Shokaku and Zuikaku, meanwhile, fought many more battles. Shokaku, in particular, was constantly damaged. The end result is these two ships and their crews becoming the veterans of the Japanese carrier force. Or at least the shipboard crews. Their pilots, on the other hand, were barely trained by the end, as was common with Japanese pilots. For her part, Zuikaku would prove to be the last survivor of Japan's pre-war fleet carriers. Guess these two had the last laugh, as it were. Again, if anyone has other examples, by all means let me know. I'm always up for learning new things. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.